Insurgent Empire is a book that it's chunky, big as you can see, and written by a scholar who spent more than a decade, I think, working on it and thinking about it. But it reads like a group of stories, short stories, and in fact, Priya is aware of it. She says that in the end, it actually feels like it's an epic. So a collection of episodes that reads like an epic with the analysis framing everything. And it's the epic, I would say, of Third World resistance to British colonial rule. And all the other things that go with it, with denial of the significance of that in the British and the European mind. So we'll talk about that. The first speaker will be Priya Gopal, who will talk a little bit about the book and then read a bit from it. And then we'll have Aziz Rana, who is a professor in Cornell Law School, who has a book, it's called Two Faces of American Freedom. And you'd be surprised, even though the two of them hadn't met, how much the two perspectives complement each other. The two narratives complement each other. One focusing on the US, the other focusing on the UK, but it's not just the UK. And then even the focus is not really on the US, it's US in its imperial role as well. Imperial both outside and inside the US. So I think these are incredibly important books to read and talk about, and so that's why we've organized this conversation. But it's not just about the past, it's about, as I've been trying to suggest, what do we do with this knowledge now? Both Insurgent Empire and the Two Faces of American Freedom try to dispel and attack myths, which is that good ideas go from here to the third world where there's nothing. Some people live there, but ideas like freedom come from here and go there. That's a myth. And good historians are not just nice people, they find facts, like Priyamvada Gopal has done, to dispel those myths. That's some of the same kind of thing that's done in Aziz Rana's book. The question then is, what do we do with that? What do we learn from that now, at this moment? What does that tell us about how we're dealing with the current rise of extremism and particularly racialized white identities? So I'm going to stop there, but I want to suggest that we keep these things at the back of our minds, not just a reevaluation, a disruption of myths and a reevaluation of the past, but also what we're going to do with it now, because we all live in a time where we need to think more clearly, learn as much of the relevant details about the past as necessary and as we can, and then figure out what we can do, what we're going to do tomorrow.
I wanted to give my thanks to Satya for organizing this conversation, which I think is wonderful. Satya taught me many years ago, and I'm a little bit nervous because he's asked me to address a few questions, so I've written all the answers down like a presentation, like I had to do back in the day. And I hope he's more impressed today than he was back in the day. Thank you also to Buffalo Street Books for hosting this, and thank you all for coming here. Ithaca is absolutely my favorite place. The book, as I will explain in a minute, is very, very different from the kind of PhD work that I did here, which was on dissident movements in the Indian subcontinent, and actually takes me back to the British Empire, which is something that I thought people had already worked on, but I was wrong. But actually, the governing idea behind the book is a quotation that was part of a speech given a couple of hours north of here in Rochester, New York, and this is the famous speech that the great abolitionist and former slave Frederick Douglass gave on the occasion in 1857, at the anniversary of the West India emancipation. And I'll just read a bit of that quotation to remind us. He talks in this speech about the importance of England, the importance of abolition, the role that white abolitionists have played, but then he goes on to talk about the centrality, which is often written out, of the agency of rebellious slaves themselves and of the agency of black people in defining freedom. And he very famously pronounces something which I think has to be key to our own times today. He says, "The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and never will. And that's something that's been on my mind for many, many years, the idea that we can sit back while power gives us whatever concessions and freedoms it feels okay to give us. And over the years, I came up with the idea of writing about the fact that Douglas was right, and no concession has ever been given to us without a struggle. On a more personal note, the book began when I was, in my head, I realize now, when I was invited onto the BBC to talk about Neil Ferguson's book on the Empire in 2006. And I was on there with two other eminent historians, Neil Ferguson himself, and an eminent black theologian called Robert Beckford. And in the course of that discussion, it became very, very clear how very aggressive the defense of Britishness, British values, so-called British values in the British Empire were in British life, and how actually there was really very little contestation of it. So in the course of that discussion, it turned out that only I and Robert Beckford were prepared really to raise in any sustained way the question of what empire had entailed: land grabs, ethnic cleansing, famines, racism, resource expropriation, huge amounts of violence and dispossession. Book of a little bit of the anecdote with which I begin, where I talk about this incident on the radio. That evening, the BBC took the unprecedented step of replacing the usual repeat of the morning's episode with a phone-in program to discuss the morning's Barney, the term Andrew Marr, the host of the program, used to refer to the exchange between myself, Beckford, and Ferguson. Sitting alongside him in what can only be described as an embarrassingly proto-colonial gesture was a young American woman of Indian descent whose main purpose, it would seem, was to reassure the BBC's listeners that I by no means represented young Indians. I was young then. Young Indians who, she suggested, was either indifferent or very positively disposed to the empire. In a particularly bizarre piece of apparently clinching evidence, she noted that her grandfather, who had grown up in British India, routinely saluted her white husband when they visited him. This incident and the significant amounts of both angry and appreciative mail I received after writing a related piece for the Guardian newspaper heralded what would become a somewhat unexpected engagement with the British relationship to the imperial past and the manifold silences in thinking about the empire. My own students at Cambridge, studying what was then coyly referred to as Commonwealth literature, came to class with very little knowledge of what the empire was or how it lived on in the present. And to their credit, they were keen to know more. And I have to say that in many ways this book has been written for my students who've been actually very, very unsparing and committed to knowing more about the imperial past. It became clear to me that some form of reparative history was desperately needed in the British public sphere, which is still subject to a familiar ritual where politicians of various stripes will periodically announce that Britain has nothing to apologize for, or, somewhat paradoxically, call for active pride in the legacies of the empire. These calls often set aside the somewhat contradictory claim that to criticize imperial misdeeds, supposedly by the values of our time, is an anachronistic gesture. I would assume you're familiar with this, that to criticize racism in the 19th century or slavery is anachronistic because everybody was okay with it then. But is it anachronistic to subject the empire to searching criticism? This book is in part a response to that question, and in part a very different take on the history of the British Empire to what is generally available in the British public sphere. In academia, a retrograde strain of making the so-called case for colonialism is now resurgent. And it actually, there's a piece by an American academic by the name of Bruce Gilley, and he's written this piece called The Case for Colonialism. As a scholar whose prior work had been on dissident writing in the Indian subcontinent as it transitioned to independence, I was aware that all societies and cultures have radical and liberationist currents woven into their social fabric, as well as people who spoke up against what was being done in their name. Why would Britain in the centuries of imperial rule be an exception? At the same time, I also wanted to probe the tenacious mythology which Satya just spoke about, that ideas of freedom are uniquely British in conception or American in conception. In a way, that idea has been actually picked up by America, that America is the source and fountain of freedom. And that independence itself was a British quote-unquote gift to the colonies, along with the railways and the English language. The result is a study which looks at the relationship between British critics of empire and great movements of resistance to British rule which emerged across colonial contexts. The case against colonialism, it will be seen, was made repeatedly over the last couple of centuries, and it emerged, moreover, through an understanding of resistance to empire. So that's the kind of general framework of the book. I think Satya asked me to talk a little bit about what the goals were in writing this book, and one was to provide a counter-history that students and general readers could use. But the other thing is that I do see a connection between the work I did here when I was at Cornell on dissident movements in the Indian subcontinent and dissident movements in the metropole in Britain. So the question really is, how do ideas which dissident movements hold dear, anti-authoritarianism, justice, equality, anti-hierarchic values, how do these operate in relation to each other as the globe starts to shrink? And the globe, of course, starts to shrink very much as a consequence of empire. I also wanted to give a backstory to the history of Asian and Black, African, and Caribbean agency. That very often, even in left-wing discourse, people of color, the third world, is seen as something, or seen as people who are acted upon rather than as agents. And one of the central arguments I make is that we have to look at the ways in which they're not only agents in their own liberation, but they also act to teach dissidents in Britain, in Europe, and indeed in America about dissidents and resistance. I also wanted to kind of question the whole idea of who the we is when we say, we in America or we in Britain, because there is no simple we, and the fact that there is no simple we is connected to the fact that we have dissident heritages. So often we will use the we in relation to government action, or we'll use it in relation to the state. But actually the real question is, when you say we, are you referring, for instance, to what the state has done, or are you referring to the dissident ancestors, the dissident heritage, which in many ways, certainly in Britain, has been forgotten? I also wanted to give a little bit of heft to some of the discussions around decolonizing the curriculum, but also decolonizing Britain more generally. I don't know if in America the controversy around the statue of Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes at Oxford University was, our students at Oxford and beyond had been militating for that statue to be pulled down. But actually they weren't really only just talking about that statue. They had a list of several demands which had to do with anti-racism and anti-imperialism, and the statue was only one small part of it. But it struck me that it kind of ties into some of the debates that you've been having here around Confederate legacies and the Confederate statues and memorializing that period. What did I discover? I discovered, unsurprisingly, a very long history of resistance, certainly in the colonies and by the enslaved, the indentured, and the colonized. But I also discovered that these resistances were read and understood and had an impact back in Britain, back in the metropole. And I describe a process which I call reverse tutelage, whereby Black and Asian dissidents, ordinary Black and Asian people fighting anti-colonial, anti-slavery fights are acting as teachers back in the metropole. So that the direction of influence is in the other direction, something Satya referred to earlier. You also discover, of course, that freedom does not mean just one thing, and this is something Aziz, I'm sure, will talk about. He writes about this in his book on American freedom. Freedom meant something very different for British imperialists who claimed to be bestowing freedom upon the colonies, and it meant something very different to people who were resisting the empire. So, for instance, the rebels of Morant Bay in Jamaica in 1865 were very directly opposing the idea of capitalist freedom that was being imposed on them. They were being told that once they had stopped being slaves, they were now free to be wage laborers, and they were having none of it. They had no intention of being wage laborers. They had no intention of being part of the capitalist economy. And people back in the metropole understood that. And it's very, very interesting to see how very clear they are that these ex-slaves and their descendants must be made to come into the capitalist economy and be, in a sense, made to be free to work for capitalists and for plantation owners. And finally, when I look at the 1920s and 1930s, going into the post-war period, I discovered to my interest that a lot of anti-colonialists did not accept any kind of sharp distinction between colonialism and fascism. And I think this is something that is coming back to our discussions today. So in Britain, there's a very sharp distinction between the benevolent British Empire, which may have made some mistakes but was basically okay, and the bad Germans who were fascists, right? And that is operative even today in Brexit, that whole idea that, you know, Brexit can be Empire 2.0, but we have to leave Europe. And you can see a very contradictory movement there. On the one hand, to say we are being colonized by Europe and we must leave because we are being colonized by Europe, but we must leave in order to be the British Empire all over again. So there's a kind of, it's bad for us to be colonized, but it's not bad for other people to be colonized by us. And I think that that's something that's very interesting in relation to discussions today. And finally, I know Satya wants us to talk about lessons for today. There are several, and I'm sure we'll have time to discuss them. Certainly, one thing I end the book urging people to do is drawing on the work of the writer Jamaica Kincaid, to say that we all need to develop a more demanding relationship to our histories, a more demanding relationship not just to our personal histories, but the histories of our communities and our nations. We need to think about agency and the ways in which we are not just victims of history, but also agents. We need to do the difficult work of learning from different movements of resistance. There are movements of resistance in America, in Britain, and across the world. And that has always been, I think, the motive force for global alliances and for building solidarities. And building solidarities, I think, particularly at a time when we're being encouraged to play race against class, or to play the white, so-called white working classes against people of color, it's really, really important to think about how one might build solidarities. And finally, and that's one reason I'm very grateful for today, is how to bridge the gaps between thinking and writing on the one hand, and doing and campaigning on the other, how to have these conversations with campaigners, to remove the university from the grip of corporate power and to put it back where it belongs, having discussions with people and with societies. And finally, I want to end on a personal note that is also a political note. Colonialism, as Satya said earlier, is not just about white versus non-white, or black versus white, or third world versus first world. Today, the country that I come from, India, which fought a very brilliant anti-colonial struggle, is today itself operating as a colonizer. And it is operating as a colonizer in ways that show how beautifully it has learned the lesson of how to colonize and how to put a repressive apparatus in place. So colonialism isn't restricted geographically to one historical moment or one geographical or cultural context. And for me, thinking about how British dissidents tried to be allies and critics of empire, in a way those lessons are now coming back to me as I think about how I position myself, I and others, as dissidents alongside the people of Kashmir as they are pounded into the ground by the state of India. It is deeply shameful that a country that fought colonialism can act as it is today. So I'm going to end on that note. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about what I see as some of the most significant contributions of the book, and then in a sense raise one big question, which is both about the history and our own shared American and let's say, British contemporary political president. So the first thing I think that's worth saying is that the book is an incredible historical and imaginative reconstruction of anti-colonial resistance among black, brown, and white constituencies across really, 4 continents. So the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Europe. And in the process, what it really does is I think it absolutely explodes one of the most conventional moves when talking about the imperial past and really basically any injustice that's sustained over time, which is to say it is inappropriate to judge past bad behavior by contemporary standards. It's not fair because, folks didn't realize that X, Y, or Z was a problem, and so in a sense, you're behaving anachronistically by holding them to contemporary views. And, in the British imperial context, the figure that I think of most clearly with this is Churchill. So Churchill is a kind of like father of the nation, saved the country from World War II. Every other year it seems like there's a movie about the genius of Churchill. He was also one of the foundational figures in maintaining the imperial project, including during World War II in the context of an ostensible war against racism with Nazi Germany, highlighting precisely the ways in which colonialism and fascism were in fact stitched together. And what the book does, by working through 2 centuries of sustained anti-imperial resistance, is to note that it's not that Churchill's views are somehow alone on a political landscape, but they're actually part of a struggle. It's one side within a decided political struggle. And so to engage in a history that erases the resistance is essentially to neuter our own collective political memory, because it means that it essentially elevates those that sustain positions of domination, subordination over time, and it eliminates our ability to see a continuity between our own struggles today and those in the past. So I think that's a really significant element of the book's project. The second thing that I think is actually a really important contribution that comes out explicitly in the introduction and the conclusion, but is stitched through all of the different episodes from 1857 over the course of the following century in the book, is the way in which the problem of empire is not just when, empires actually had direct political control over colonies, but empire's afterlife. And by this I mean that empires in general, and in this way the British Empire is not unique, the American imperial project, both in the past and today, is not unique. Empires in general tell stories of their own exceptionality. In other words, the American imperial project is about spreading freedom and democracy around the globe. The French imperial project is about spreading universalite and notions of republicanism. The British imperial project is about English liberty. And what this means is that to the extent that these imperial projects tell stories about why they're different, why what they're engaged in is not just expropriation and brutalization, it provides a continuous justification for their own enterprise. But it also then serves to reinterpret the end of empire. So the story in England, frankly, just like the story in the US, about the end of the British Empire is really a story about, well, the internal values within England were so bound to liberty that it was actually the internal working out of an English conception of justice that led to the end of the imperial project. And this is a deeply, I think, disturbing myth. I mean, it's a disturbing myth because it, again, reads out the actual brutality and so provides a myth about the meaning of the imperial project. But it's also disturbing because what it does is in the present, it provides a continual justification for the extension in lots of problematic ways of imperial power in a post-imperial age. So just think about, we think about the Iraq War as a story, for example, of the US. As Priya shows, the Iraq War in her introduction is also a story of Britain. And what were the arguments that were being made in Britain about justifications for going into Iraq? They were absolutely tied to a judgment of the benevolence of British power going back multiple centuries. And so the failure to confront the narratives about imperial exceptionalism produces an afterlife in which abroad you see the continuous extension of various kinds of really deeply racialized and problematic forms of power that are playing out domestically as well in the context of Brexit and the rise of racialized nationalism in England. And of course, domestically, it also means, yet again, a failure to confront one's own past, and so to perpetuate forms of racial hierarchy. Then the third argument that I think is really significant that the book makes is that it really explodes the idea that there is some distinction in the modern period between Western and this catch-all category of non-Western thought, or Occident and Orient. And instead, what I think Priya does really powerfully is to highlight how there is a common global predicament that marks the last series of centuries. And that's the colonial predicament and the truly globalizing experience of empire. And that common predicament stitches together people, in wildly divergent places across the globe, in Jamaica, in India, in London. And it means that they're engaged in a common conversation, where it's not the case that concepts are the possession of particular elites in a metropolitan center, but instead are being worked out continuously at the same time in all of these different spaces and sites. And so even to think in terms of Western and non-Western makes no sense. Gandhi, is Gandhi a non-Western or a Western thinker? No, these are figures that are part of a common historical conversation and predicament. And so I think that's another really important point that comes through by just charting the back and forth conversations that are taking place. Now, the thing that I'd like to just raise as something for us to ponder and sort of reflect on for some of the conversation, I'd be curious about Priya's thoughts on this. It's really the difficulty in England and in the US. And in some ways, this is just a story of the difficulty in empires, period. But the difficulty in England and the US of being able to get majority or near majority white support for an anti-imperial project. So one of the things that the book really highlights, and this is something that I've done in my own work, is to show that there's in fact an authentic indigenous anti-imperial tradition within Anglo communities or white communities that's part of a reflection about the material conditions of one's own society. But in the US, I think the story is that this becomes a tradition that has near or majority white support only at very rare moments in time. It's there in the States in the context of abolition and radical reconstruction in the 1860s and 70s. It has elements within the populist movement in the 1890s, within labor in the first third of the 20th century. You can look to the kind of anti-Cold War politics in the 60s and 70s. And similarly, I think you can tell a story in England where it has greater and less support at different moments in time, but for the most part, this is a minority strand. And the fact that it's a minority strand raises real problems about how do you transform politics at the center among communities that conceive of themselves oftentimes primarily in racialized terms, as whose primary form of solidarity is a kind of white solidarity that justifies various types of rule. To raise this in an historical and a contemporary way, I'd just like to make kind of 2 points. The first is, part of the difficulty is that both in England and in the US, it's not just that there's a psychic benefit that you gain from being part of an empire. It's that being a subject in the home country actually brings with it real material benefits. The high tide of the British Empire is a time in which you have massive extraction of wealth from other parts of the world, and that massive extraction, whatever the profound and intense class conflicts that are taking place domestically, actually produces material benefits, real material benefits. And in England, for example, one of the reasons why I think you have the persistence of a kind of nostalgia for empire is, when is it that empire ends? Empire ends during and after World War II, when the country is absolutely devastated financially. And it's really the material condition of that devastation that's part of what generates the end of empire. And that means that there are oftentimes real difficulties in being able to convince people that something like social democracy at home doesn't go hand in hand with empire. Even in the US, the white egalitarianism throughout the 19th century is built on native land expropriation, the fact that you can use that land to create relatively equal conditions among whites. The Cold War. The Cold War is a time of massive economic boom, where during World War II and then after World War II, investment, peacetime investment in a military infrastructure actually helps facilitate, rising economic tides for newly unionized white working class. And so these connections, the ways in which empire and social democracy actually historically have been stitched together, require a response that has to be sustained. And this brings me to the last point, which is one of the things that's really noteworthy about Priya's book is that not all, but many of the examples of dissident, resisting politics are really drawn from an international working class labor movement. It's socialist internationalism that is third world, that is European, that understands itself as sharing common bounds. That's one of the central voices of anti-colonial resistance. And to me, the figure that most embodies this in the book is a British member of Parliament of South Asian descent named Satya Mohanty, who was associated with the Communist Party, is a radical figure, and the central argument that he makes, and he makes these two white laboring constituencies, is that you are not part of an English nation. There's no such thing. I and folks in South Asia are not part of an Indian nation. There's no such thing. Each of these communities have two classes, those that are expropriating and those that are laboring. And it's that class identity that's the basis for constructing something like international solidarity and commitment. And this highlights to me that rather than thinking of class and race as in conflict, at least historically, oftentimes class and making class arguments was the way in which you can convince majority white societies to broaden their own conception of membership, to reduce a kind of commitment to racial solidarity by recognizing that, actually we have material interests with people that might not look like us, and for that reason we should be committed to common political projects. And it was most, consistently sustained by elements within the international labor movement. And it makes me wonder whether or not, even more so than the end of the colonial period and the kind of problems that decolonization wrought with first generation, second generation of national elites in the global south, that it's really the decline of an international labor politics that can talk in these terms that's had a very significant effect on being able to sustain something like anti-imperial politics now. So, there is clearly a labor politics, but that labor politics is national. It rarely thinks in the terms that Satya Mohanty described, and it produces a contemporary predicament where it's much easier, I think, for people who feel themselves weighed down by the forces of capital to understand their interests as actually stitching together, let's say, social democracy and empire, rather than seeing, well, actually, social democracy at home has to go hand in hand with anti-imperialism abroad. And that's, in a way, I think, the hardest part of the present. So, thoughts on that as a way to generate conversation?
Thank you for your questions. The answer to some of your questions, Aziz, is that yes, it is a marginal tradition, a minority tradition. But I think it's quite important to resurrect those traditions because they hold out possibilities. Right? You're quite right that they don't explain where we are now. They have not prevailed, but they existed. And I would also say that it's not entirely the case that resistance remained marginal. One of the arguments of the book along the way is that, and this again comes from Douglas, that what power presents to us as something that it's giving to us is often taken from resistance, repackaged, and then offered to us as a concession. I mean, anti-racism is a good example. That anti-racism had to be fought for years. What we take for granted now in terms of equalities legislation, even if, it's more honored in the breach, it didn't just come from above. Power has no reason to give you anti-racist legislation. So a lot of equalities legislation which comes to us from establishment institutions were once minority traditions, were pushed for by dissidents. But, that's the kind of hopeful side of the story. In terms of the international working classes, yes, a good chunk of the middle part of the narrative is precisely about international socialism. But lots of it is about organization that often was spontaneous, often exceeded the bounds of the union movement, and often was presented precisely as in the case of the black intellectuals I talk about in London, as a critique of the white left, as a critique of, the British trade union movement to this day can be deeply xenophobic. Brexit in many ways has continued because there is a significant chunk of the British trade union movement that has backed it, and has backed it for anti-immigrant reasons. So contesting some of the international left's blind spots, so that being a dissident tradition within a dissident tradition is also important. But your points are well taken. How do we take this for the present? How do we also account for the huge material vested interests in things like whiteness, in things like being British as opposed to being European or being international? Those are good questions, and I can't pretend to have the answers in any sense. It's an act of faith, I guess, some of what I've written about.
I really think we are essentially across both the US and Europe living in profoundly different times than even just a decade ago. And that's actually something that's really noteworthy. And I experienced it, as a faculty member here, and also just thinking back to what the political climate was like when I was a student. That, in the States, the way that you can tell the story in part is that there have been a series of rolling social crises, from an Iraq war fought under false conditions to the financial crisis in Occupy that emerged out of the financial crisis, to the rolling social protests from 2014 to 2016 in the U.S. that really highlighted mass incarceration despite the fact that you had the first African-American president. And I think all of this has created a political constituency that's vibrant and active, that wants to and is conscious about stitching together the foreign and the domestic in a way that really I don't think we've seen in the US or in England in decades. Now, that kind of space, I think, on the left has gone hand in hand with an opening up of space on the far right that is responding to the breakdown of elite authority by reasserting explicit forms of white supremacy, either in a kind of nostalgic Middle Englander position or domestic here in the U.S. and the return of like a virulent white nationalism. But I think it would be a mistake to see the present exclusively through the rise of that kind of white nationalist politics and not recognize that part of the reason to have these conversations about how do you build a majority that's actually committed to social democracy and anti-imperialism is because for the first time, maybe in a half century, that's actually something that's conceivable. Like, you could in fact have an electoral coalition that can win serious national office in the US and England around those kinds of policies. And that means that these questions are not purely academic questions, but they're actually now questions about politics.
The indigeneity question is in a way relatively easily answered. It is complex. Partly, as Satya says, the question of who is indigenous. If we start to have a fact-based discussion about this with the people who are claiming indigeneity, it becomes very clear that Hindus, upper caste Hindus, are not indigenous in any sense to most of India, still less Kashmir. In fact, the question of indigeneity is quite important to say, well, actually, what about the Kashmiris? And what enables today Indians to go and take land in Kashmir? It is precisely protected land for the people who are, in a sense, indigenous to Kashmir. So indigeneity, I think, partly can be approached through a very sharply factual, evidence-based historical approach, but that's exactly what is being pushed aside in favor of mythology, right? So in a sense, it is the struggle of history against mythology. What we're up against is the mythologizing of indigeneity rather than an actual engagement. I mean, actual Adivasis, as Satya said earlier, are as much at the sharp end of the state as Kashmiris are today. My hope, in some sense, has been that the Ambedkarite and the Adivasi movements are going to provide the resistance to the colonialism of the Indian state. But now, to go back to the kind of difficulties in solidarity, when you see Dalit Bahujan leaders endorse the Indian state on what it is doing in Kashmir, then you think, oh my God, this is actually far more complex. So how to build solidarity, Kanishka, is a difficult question. I think some of what Aziz said is exactly right. Some of what I saw when doing the research for the book is an invitation to people to think about what it would be like to be in the position. So for instance, English audiences were invited by British anti-colonialists to say, well, how would you feel if the French came up, sailing up the Thames, asked to establish factory on the side, and then tomorrow ruled you and made all of you speak French? Think about how you might feel. In part, solidarity is an imaginative experiment, right? That you invite people to put themselves in the place. So common experience, yes, but when you don't have that common experience, to invite people to say, what might it be imaginatively to be at the receiving end of the kinds of oppression that we're talking about. The thing that in the book that I kind of cling to, perhaps in a hopeful way, it partly comes out of some of the work that Satya's done, some of the work that Susan Buck-Morss, who's in the audience today, has done on universalism, which is the distinction between the false universalism of the colonizer and thinking about the real universalism of struggle. Because there is a certain universality to struggle that people everywhere, from the slave who was put on the ship to the indentured, in the Caribbean, to Kashmiris today, people do push against tyranny. That is the one universal in a sense. Now, obviously, people are in multiple complicated positions, which means they can be pushing against tyranny and be tyrannizers at the same time. You talk about that in your book as well, and in terms of American freedom being premised on the oppression of the indigenous and the enslaved. So how do you talk about American freedom when it's at once, it is kind of Janus-faced in one sense. So I don't have answers, but I think certainly where I would disagree slightly in emphasis from you, Aziz, I don't think that America and Britain are going through a particularly odd phase or an unusual phase today. I think it is global, and in fact, I think the real danger zones are in the former colonies. I think the most dangerous place on earth today is India. And there are other places where similar sorts of dynamics are replicating, including in the Middle East. So in a way, what America, and I keep saying this, what's happening in America and in Britain is very, very serious, but it's actually nothing, not yet, compared to what is taking place in former colonies and their embrace of the dynamic of colonialism. So, where is the resistance going to come from? As I said to you, Pranita, it's complex. For a while, my hopes were in the kind of Ambedkarite, anti-caste, but also the fact that there are dissident traditions also in India and within Hinduism. You've done some work on that, and those dissident traditions, which were also marginal minority traditions, what happens if we can recover them and put them back into the frame? I wish I had better answers.
On solidarity, my own basic view about it is that the way that most people come to see themselves as sharing common projects is by having similar concrete experiences. And this is one of the reasons why I actually think historically that the class has actually been such a significant category for stitching together groups of divergent backgrounds, because folks can say, okay, I'm in a coal mine in the United States, but then I'm also, let's say, in a diamond mine in South Africa, and the actual structure, the relations of domination that exist in these different settings have much in common, and they're bound together by a similar set of elite corporate actors within a specific kind of global context. And it doesn't just have to be class, but there's a way in which I think solidarity emerges out of being able to tell stories of common oppression. And The problem, of course, is that if it just remains at the level of shared material interest, then it can really be broken down by arguments that say, well, actually, you know, protectionism is the best way to ensure that you have high wages, and actually it's like working people on the other side of the border that are the ones that are threatening your jobs. And so there has to be some moment where you initially begin with commonality of everyday experience, but that commonality of everyday experience becomes something that transcends it, where there's a kind of ethical commitment that says, no, the reason why we see ourselves as in a shared predicament isn't necessarily even because like your oppression is something that I experience, but rather that I understand your humanity as bound to my own, and that my humanity can't in fact be fulfilled unless yours is liberated. And it's that process which I think takes a really long time and emerges basically through shared political projects that was at the heart of anti-colonial resistance throughout the 20th century, was at the heart of some of, I think, like the most transformative elements of the international labor movement, and that is the sort of ground zero that needs to be restitched today. Like the one thing that I'd say about it is, I think it's very difficult, this might just be too abstract a way of responding, it's really difficult to build solidarity when you presume that the people that you're trying to connect in shared community all have to have the same first principles. Like they have to have the same view about like what the foundational oppression is, or what like the theory of the person is, if we're thinking philosophically, or even like how they imagine their country or what narratives they present. So that some of this is actually meeting people where they are and figuring out ways to create shared projects, and then through the success of like tangible successes on the ground of those political projects, folks can recognize the ways in which people can work together and that you can build, greater and greater alliances. To the extent that labor, feminist, and black freedom struggles worked cooperatively and successfully at various points in the mid-20th century, it was precisely because of these pragmatic arrangements, not necessarily because of desire to require everybody to go back to first principles as a way of justifying themselves.
The reparations question, it's much more explicit in relation to slavery. So the Caribbean nations who have put very firmly on the international table the question of reparations, that's being discussed. Empire and reparations are not being discussed for better or for worse. I have very mixed feelings about some of the reparations debates in terms of who gets to represent former colonies, and that would be the Indian nationalists, certainly not in a position to demand reparations. The question of apology is what has come on the table. So last year there was a whole discussion about apologizing for Amritsar. And my position at that point was, anything that leads to an acknowledgement of the empire's crimes is good, but the Indian state, when it demands apologies from Britain, must at that very same moment be held to account as well, and to ask what are your crimes by the same standards. So great, let us invoke anti-colonialism as a standard, but you would then be obliged to say in what ways have we failed the standards that we are asking the British to hold themselves to today.
On the question of indigeneity, I think this is a huge problem for all of the so-called post-colonial states. Despite efforts at a new international economic order and non-aligned notions of figuring out ways to have alternatives to a single trajectory of global capital development, the simple truth is that most of the states across the global south ended up replicating a very particular state form that by the time we get to the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century is quote-unquote neoliberal in economic order, but you can think of this as committed to access to capital markets, built around various forms of deregulation, a presumption that markets and market access is the primary way that you have to organize economic policy, and it's tied to a particular kind of extractive state, and a state that's associated with an ethno-national identity. And one of the things that it really produces certainly you see this in in Asia and Africa and parts of Latin America, is a basic conflict between what you can think of as the third and the fourth world. So like indigenous constituencies on the ground that contest the extractive projects of their own states and are committed in various ways for either restitutive or reparative projects or maintaining access to resources on terms that are incompatible with like the nation state framework. And it's that conflict that has basically been papered over by a presentation of the story of empire as exclusively a story of the West and the rest. And it's also that conflict that's now getting replicated as you see the rise of all of these regional powers that are from the global south. Because really the story of the present is, in many ways, we're living at the end of the American century. And American power continues to be incredibly hot, but its justificatory bases basically collapse. And its operation globally doesn't have anything like the kind of continuous reach in some ways that it did previously. And so you have the emergence of China, the emergence of India, the emergence of Brazil, but states that haven't worked through this basic tension between third and fourth world, or the meaning of a non-European power that doesn't conceive of itself as just replicating the same state forms.
Writing this book, I was very deeply aware that my own terms of reference, even though I do believe in a universalism that is not located in Europe, that European universalism has been deeply parochial, I find it hard to think outside Europe. And some of the people that I write about in the book are also aware of this. So, C.L.R. James saying, I didn't know anything about Africa till I came to London. And when I came to London, I had to start thinking about blackness. And it is only in London that I started to think about what it meant to have a black self. Yeah, and he's not making a kind of ontological argument, he's not making an essentialist argument, but he is saying that in order to universalize, you actually have to study. And he talks about going to the British Museum. He and Pat Moore and others going to the British Museum to research African cultures, to try and understand, what has been theorized in other sites. Nancy Cunard puts together this amazing anthology called Negro. And part of the aim there is to say, how do we kind of come up with a universalism that is robust and has been theorized in multiple sites and doesn't just belong to Europe. So in a sense, your point, I think, about the particular and the universal not being in opposition and the universal being arrived at through struggle and the language of struggle often being particular, whether that's immigration or whether that's the enslaved, is I think important. So we have to find a way to grasp the particular and to think outside Europe without essentializing that. Because one important thing about empire is this. Empire is about following the money. Race and culture, everything else is fundamental to it. They're not accretions. But what you are seeing now, in a sense, is that the motor of empire is going to the so-called growing economies. And it's no accident that the rise of fascism is also happening in places like Brazil, right? India. China is already an authoritarian state. Russia, again, a whole host of problems to do with authoritarianism and oligarchic rule. So the question really, again, I find the colonial fascism, the breaking down of that distinction, I guess more interesting in terms of thinking about what is happening in the BRICS and their rise as imperial powers following the money. And yes, there are kind of all kinds of contradictions in that phenomenon.
So much of what we know is because of hard work of people, and you're standing on the shoulders of other people, but there's a real continuity between what we can imagine, which leads to good activism, right? And the hard work that's done by good thinkers in archives and boring places like libraries. So that's on that note that I'd like to thank you again